Hi! Activehistory.ca is pleased to present a recording of Nos Glorieuses, 100 Years of Women's Hockey in Quebec. This talk was by Lynda Baril as part of the Ottawa Historical Association lecture series and was delivered on September 16, 2014. You can find recordings of other talks at Activehistory.ca.
I'm a bit nervous because it's my first time ever. I'm usually asking questions. I'm not talking in front of people. So if ever you do want to ask me questions, please don't hesitate. You don't have to wait until I'm finished. I'll be more than happy to answer all your questions. Thank you, Jennifer Anderson, and thank you to the Ottawa Historical Association to having invited me here tonight. I'm especially pleased because Ottawa is the cradle of women's hockey in Canada, as you probably all know. By the way, I wondered if everyone is a hockey historian here, like Andrew and Paul Kitchen. Are you all into hockey's history?
Yes.
Yes? Oh my God. And did you all grow up with women who played hockey around you, or?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Who's from Ontario here? Everyone? Is there anyone from Quebec? Okay. Because
BC.
BC, good. Jennifer introduced me, so it's already done. I grew up in a small town called Comet in Quebec in the 1960s. And no one around me in a very French-speaking city, and no one around me played hockey. Little boys did play hockey, but I didn't know of any woman who did play hockey. Girls didn't play hockey in our French-speaking community. I played with a friend of mine, with a little girlfriend. I remember, it's funny how memory works, because I remember I was 6 or 7 and I had some sort of a Mickey Mouse watch. And we were just the two of us on the family ice rink, and I was going in the corner of the rink and I was talking to Mickey Mouse and saying, "Okay, watch me now. Watch me, I'm gonna score a goal." And then I was skating as fast as possible to score. But I knew very well that there was no girls team, there was no girls league, there was no championship for girls or trophies or applause or whatsoever. So I became a journalist, and a few years ago, some 10 years ago already, I did work on that CBC Radio-Canada co-production called Hockey, A People's History. And that's when I saw Brian McFarlane's book. I don't know if you know that book, which was published some 20 years ago about women's hockey history in Canada. Have you seen it? Have you ever seen it? It was a book published some 20 years ago, and it was an overview of Canadian women's hockey history. But it didn't focus, it spanned all Canada, but it didn't focus specifically on Quebec. And I was just totally flabbergasted. I was totally astonished to see a woman, probably you not because you grew up, but in French Quebec, I had never seen a woman with a long skirt and holding a hockey stick in her hand. And I thought, my goodness, women have been playing for over 100 years, and how come? And then I'd never heard of that before, and I had never seen such pictures. And I thought, well, women were playing in Ontario, they were playing in Prince Edward Island, they were playing in Alberta, in Manitoba, but were they playing in Quebec? Did the French-Canadian play, and when did it all started, and so on? So I thought, I'm going to dig this, because no book had never been written on the matter in Quebec. This story had never been told before or never been showed in Quebec. So when the series was over, I started to do some research on it by weekends or at night, and discovered, among other things, that already in 1875 there were young women playing hockey with the Montreal hockey pioneers of the time. You know, this bunch of young McGill students who did play the first modern hockey game in Montreal with a very specific set of rules, because men and boys had been playing for a long time, but with no specific rules. So this was a turning point in hockey's history. And when those young men who were members of the Victoria Club in Montreal at night had some dinner parties, they would invite their female friends to play hockey with them afterwards. And this story was told to the Montreal Gazette in 1943 by Henry James, who was one of the young McGill students who was part of that famous hockey game on a night of March 1875. So I was quite astonished that already young women had been playing. But the first recorded ladies' game here in Canada took place here in Ottawa on the Rideau Hall rink. Do you all know of Isabel Stanley? Yeah? No? Everyone knows about her? No? Okay. So Isabel Stanley, okay, I told you there would be some pictures, so I should show you a few. So here is Isabel Stanley. She was the daughter of then Governor General Lord Arthur Frederick Stanley, who came to Canada in 1888. And the following winter, in 1889, he was in Montreal at the Montreal Winter Carnival, and he discovered, from what the story says, ice hockey in Montreal, and he fell in love with the game, and his daughter was with him. She was 13 at the time, 13 years old, and she also fell in love with the game. So Lord Stanley had this huge rink on Rideau Hall, and he invited men and women to play hockey once in a while. So the first recorded ladies' game happened there in Ottawa in 1889. This is quite a well-known picture, which was in Brian McFarlane's book. I don't know if you've seen this before, but Isabel Stanley was presumably the one with the white coat. So that was in 1890. The thing which is interesting that I found out is this picture, which was also been taken in 1890 in Switzerland, because British women had been playing field hockey for already quite a long time, so I guess it was not that difficult to put on skates and play what was called then often bandy or shinty or so on. So it's interesting because that's something I didn't know. I don't know, Paul, if you knew about that, but that women had been playing also quite at the same time in Europe. This is also a picture that I bought on eBay, which was taken in 1891. Some British bandy players. So you see their skates, their hats. But obviously the weather was not as cold as here, with their kind of field hockey sticks. This is also something I bought on eBay, which was published in 1893. This was it was a ladies' match on the lake in Wimbledon Park in London, and this was published in a British weekly newspaper called The Graphic. So you see the same kind of skates, same kind of hockey sticks, same kind of hats, but they play with a ball. They don't play with a puck. So these were the first ladies that we know started to play. And I often say, because my book is really an overview of 100 years of women's hockey history in Quebec. But if I was telling you earlier this afternoon, if I didn't have a mortgage to pay and 2 teens at home, I would do a PhD on the very beginning of women's hockey in Canada in the period of 1875 until 1900, because I think there is still a lot to do and to discover about this period of time. But it seems like the first Quebecers, the first Anglo-Quebecers to play were the Royal Victoria College students who asked the permission to McGill University. Royal Victoria College was part of McGill, and they asked the authorization to use the rink, and they were granted the permission under 3 conditions. They had to be warmly dressed first. Second, they had to be guarded by 3 guards, one on top of a faculty building, and also male students couldn't gather around the ring when they were playing. So, and in the very, very first book ever published in Canada about hockey, which was called Canada's Royal Winter Game, which was written by Arthur Farrell, who was a Montrealer back in 1899, already there was a drawing of a young hockey player and a line or two saying that there was a surprisingly growing number of ladies hockey teams in Canada already. And the following year, you have the cover of Harper's Bazaar magazine. I don't know if you guys know that magazine, but I'm sure the ladies do. Still there. But in 1900, the magazine was proclaiming ladies hockey the fashionable winter sport for women, already in 1900. When did the French Canadians, the French Quebecers started to play? Probably, the first, and already by that time, in the early 1900s, there were clubs, ladies' clubs in Montreal, in Three Rivers, in Sherbrooke, and Quebec City, and it was the elite who did play. As an example, in Quebec City, the daughter of the Solicitor General under Wilfrid Laurier was playing, the daughter of Quebec Chief Justice was playing, also the niece of the founder of Université Laval, the heiress of the Price family, one of the wealthiest families in Quebec. But the French elite, there was just a handful of French-speaking ladies who were playing because they were not very much into sport. Sport was not as popular as it was within the Anglo elite in Quebec. It was not a ladies' game for them. So at first, very, very few French Canadians. This is the Westmount ladies hockey team in 1902. These ladies, when they first started to play, they were practicing and playing. Men couldn't attend to their practices or games. They played in some sort of secrecy. The first game they played, there were 400 women at their game, but no male journalist, no male doorman, no one. So it's this was a team of Westmount. They played at the Westmount Arena. That's one of the interesting things that I found out, that women played in all Montreal Canadiens arenas. They played at the Westmount Arena in 1900. They played at the Jubilee Rink during World War I. They played at Montreal Arena in the 1920s, at the Montreal Forum in the 1930s and 40s. They played at Molson Center, which is now the Bell Center. So women played in all those places, which a fact that French Quebecers are not aware of. Here is Evelyn Molson, who was a player back in 1904 with the Montreal Victoria. She's the great-great-aunt of actual Montreal Canadiens owner, Jeff, Andrew, and Justin Molson. These are the kind of postcards Canadians would send abroad in the early 1900s. And these were the kind of postcard they could receive from Switzerland or from France in the early 1900s as well. I especially like this one, I don't know, like it. And these were some drawings back in 1904 and 1905 in La Presse by 3 different artists. And find it pretty funny to how they draw women who play. They're not really good looking. They're pretty ugly, especially those two here. But these are three different artists, and you see that, they're kind of, ladies who play hockey are kind of crazy, it seems. So, in 1914 in Montreal, there was a telephone operators league, which had 6 teams, 42 players. They attracted quite big crowds, several hundreds of people. It was quite popular for a season, but it lasted only 1 season. And during World War I, ladies hockey in Quebec was extremely popular. Then it was no more the elite who was playing, it was the working class had been taking over. This was a French Canadians were now playing. They were always in a minority. But there were here and there whole French Canadian teams, like this one in La Tuque, this one in Sorel, and those two in Rivière-du-Loup. I especially like this picture, which is on the cover of the book, because of the very French Canadian house, and the ice is just in front of the house, which is very convenient. And this was another French Canadian team in Montreal, the Hochelaga, the only French Canadian team during World War I in Montreal in the league. Because the best team in Montreal during World War I was the Western Ladies Hockey Club. And for the ones who know a little bit about hockey's history, look, they had the same shirt as the Montreal Wanderers. And the best player of the team was quite the whole team was English Quebecer, but the captain was the daughter of a French-Canadian carpenter, Agnès Vautier, and she was quite the best Montreal player at the time. Here is Agnès again with Albertine Lapensée, who some of you might know. She has quite an interesting story. Who knows about her? No? Albertine was a Franco-Ontarian from Cornwall, and during World War I, she was the star of ladies hockey in Quebec, in Montreal especially, but also here, I might say, in Ontario. She would make daily headlines. She was frequently invited to play in Montreal. She would attract crowds of 3,000 people every time she was at the Jubilee rink in Montreal. But ladies hockey, she really drew cheering crowds. But ladies hockey was extremely popular during World War I because men were gone to the war, rinks were free, so ladies took over. And that's what fascinates me about hockey, because it tells so much about who we are and what we've been through, the wars we fought, the crisis we went through, or the relationship between men and women, between French Canadians and English Canadians, the relationship we have with religion. It tells so many stories. So these were the 2 stars of World War I. Albertine here, as you see, there were in Montreal newspaper at the time during World War I made daily headlines, really every day, in French newspaper like La Presse or an English newspaper like Montreal Daily Star. Albertine Lapensée was champion du monde de hockey de dames, the world champion already. And here is Albertine. But Albertine was there for 2 seasons, and after 2 seasons, she just disappears. There was, I forgot to tell you, there were some rumors. Her rivals were saying, well, she cannot be a girl. Albertine and Agnès were both 17. Usually they were 17 or 18. And her rivals were saying, well, she can't be a girl. She's too good to be a girl. I mean, she's sometimes scoring 5, 6, 7 goals in a game. It just cannot be a girl. So she disappears, and in this Brian McFarlane's book, which was published some 20 years ago, he did talk with a relative of Albertine in Cornwall who said that Albertine in 1918 went to New York City, had a sex change, and came back as a man called under the name of Albert Smith and opened a gas station in Cornwall. Is the story true? I don't know. Was Albertine a man or a woman? I don't know. It's still, quite a lot of people at the CBC, when we were working on the series, did a fair lot of research trying to find out if she did exist. Albertine, had a record, she was born, she was a girl, but did she become a man, or was she really... We don't know. Still, the mystery is entire 100 years afterwards. But this was quite a decade, the 1910s for... Albertine is here, see? Whoops. This was her Cornwall team, and Albertine is the one sitting in the front row. The 1920s, you can see by the haircut that we're in a different period now. You can see a Coca-Cola ad from 1923, which was published in the Saturday Evening Post. Quite glamorous. Film fun. It looks pretty contemporary, but it was in 1926, this Film Fun magazine. Looks very glamorous, but that decade was a difficult decade for ladies hockey in Quebec, because after the war, men came back, took back the rinks, and women didn't play as much. No more headlines, no more championships, no more applause. It was sort of over. And McGill students were the backbone of ladies hockey in Montreal at the time. This was a McGill champion team in 1923, but McGill was never as good as University of Toronto team, and for that whole decade, and it would be true for most of the time in the last century. Ontario was always, or usually, stronger than Quebec when it came to championships between Quebec and Ontario. Not all the time, but often. And at the end of the 1920s came a team called the Northern Electric. These were workers from the Northern Electric who played. And his best player, again, the whole team was English speaking, but the best player of the team was Simone Cochon, who would make, in the 1930s, headlines, who had huge crowds applauding her, but at some point would fell into oblivion, like Agnès Vautier or Albertine Lapensée. We're now in the 1930s, and there are some more French-Canadian teams in Abitibi, northern Quebec. This is in 1935, all of them being miners' daughters. This is another team in near Sept-Îles, Franklin. But the French-Canadians who would play were pretty, had to have a fair bit of guts, because it was not very well regarded towards. Here is an article that I found in the Petit Journal, which was a major newspaper at the time, and it says that hockey was dangerous for women. I think there were a few of these articles also in English newspapers. Some doctors didn't like women to play hockey because it was not good for them to, for their, not fertility, but let's say it was dangerous for their organs, or I don't know how to say this, but it's very funny. In this article, they say, you have to, women are sacred vases, and you have to manage the fragile package. And they were saying they were not civilized to play hockey. So the ones who played among French Canadians, even though there was that kind of also comments, I remember reading a New York Post columnist back in, I was not there in 1941, but I read it in the archives saying that because women were told in Quebec that they looked better with a with a broom in their hands than a hockey stick. And Jack Miley was writing in 1941 that, he had never seen a woman look better with how do you say that? That women look better with a frying pan in her hands instead of a tennis racket. I guess he had never seen Jeannie Bouchard. And I was telling you that women had played in all Montreal Canadiens arena. In the 1930s, the big rivalry in Montreal was between the two professional clubs, male clubs, the French Canadians and the English Maroons, mostly. It was quite an intense rivalry. Well, there was the same among women. There was the Canadiens and there was the Maroons. And Simon Cochon, the English were good because they recruited the best player, which was Simon Cochon. He was the only French Canadian on the team too. So, and there was quite an intense rivalry between the two, and they played their finals every year at the Montreal Forum. And see, they sort of copied their male counterparts. This is quite the exact same shirt as the Montreal Maroons, and it's quite the same shirt as the Montreal Canadiens, with the difference that there's not an H in the middle of the C, but an L for Ladies Club or for the Canadiens. So this is quite something. And another quite intense rivalry were between the Maroons and the Rivalettes, the Preston Rivalettes, who were from Preston, Ontario, which were, by far the best ladies team throughout the 1930s. I think on 350 games, they lost only one, something like this. So again, Ontario was usually beating Quebec. These are the Royals. At the end, in 1939, they went on a tour, on an American tour. And there's a story I like. They went on a tour and they were playing against the Toronto ladies club called the Toronto Ladies. And a story I liked about this, she was Dickie Moore. Dickie Moore was a star with the Montreal Canadiens in the 1950s. She was his sister, his big sister, who played with the Montreal Maroons. They all played in the winter, they played hockey, in the summer they played baseball. And I like the story about Florence Junot. She was quite a good player. In September 1939, she gets married. She's 23, I think. Anyways, and she loves playing hockey. And usually women, when they played hockey, when they married, they quit hockey. So, and then came this offer with the Royal to go on the American tour, to go in Philadelphia, New York City, Manchester. And she tells her husband, well, I'm going to go in this store. And he said, well, you're married now, so you have to choose. It's marriage or it's hockey. And she took her ring and gave it back to Roland and said, it's hockey, my dear. And she went over, she went in the States and did her tour. Had a lot of fun. It's very funny because the first game, her team was losing. And I think they were losing 3-1. And in the 4 last minutes of the game, she scored 3 goals and her team won. So I guess she had something to prove to her husband. But anyways, she came back with her husband and had, kids afterwards. This was Myrtle Cook, who was, you might know about Myrtle Cook, of course, who was a columnist at the Montreal Star for nearly 40 years, I think, where she covered women's sports. And without her, it would have been impossible really to know what was going on in the 1930s in Quebec. She was also, of course, she had won a gold medal at the 1928 Olympics as a runner. So these were the champions of Quebec in 1942. This I like this picture because it's from my mother's village. This is the church where my mother was baptized and where she married and so on. And I find it a little bit funny because women were playing in the 1940s and 50s. Because of the war, women went to work, replacing very often men. So didn't have much time to play. So it was kind of the end the vanishing of organized hockey in Quebec in the 1940s and 50s, because after the war their job was to go back to the home and have kids, not to play hockey, not to run after a puck. But they always did play, but more on a recreational basis. Like in villages in Quebec, there were, winter carnivals. So they would play with the neighboring villages. They would play, 4 or 5 times during the winter, and then play against the next village. And see, they had some imagination. They didn't have any sweaters, and these were the referees. And because they didn't have any sweaters, they had those conic hats, which was the way to know, okay, he or she is. So I like those big snowmobiles. They used them to go from one place to another. Barbara Scott, who was the major, which was a big star in 1948 and the 1950s. She was a real role model for all little girls. So it was better to be a figure skater than a hockey player in Quebec at that time. This is a picture in 1950 of 2 teams, les As et les Éclairs, the Aces and the Lightning of Amos and Abitibi. And these women created 2 teams in 1950, played 4 or 5 games, and the priest on a Sunday Mass went up and said, okay, girls, it's over, because hockey is a sin. It's not a ladies' game, it's a man's game. Shouldn't be playing, so they had to disband their teams. It didn't last very long. And in 1916, there was the first French-Canadian league in Montreal. That was the first, and it's very funny. We're kind of, I don't know if you've been watching Mad Men, but it's exactly, those ladies are leaving their kitchen for the rink, and hockey on wide skates, and this surprises us. Some of them here. So there's some sort of a renewal in the 1960s, and then after 30 years of not playing against Ontario, some Quebec players organized a championship against Don Mills. This was the terrifying team of the Cougars in the 1970s. And they came very often to play here in Ontario, also in Quebec. I don't know if you're, Justin Blaney's story, this girl in Ontario who had to, finally her case went to Supreme Court. There was a similar case a few years earlier in Quebec. This young girl who was 13 at the time was a goalie on a boys' club. And Quebec Hockey Federation expelled her from the team, saying that it was dangerous for her security to be a goalie in a boys' club, and also that the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association rules didn't allow girls to play with boys. Anyway, her case went to court, and she won. The judge said that the team had to take her back. That was in 1978. And her case permitted to future champions like Nancy Drolet to play, and like Manon Réon to become a goalie as well. To tell you how I'm seeing Manon Réon, and you grew up with women's hockey, but in Quebec, when I was telling you, I had never seen a woman with a hockey stick before. It was not at all ingrained in our culture, and that story had not been told. So that's why I wanted to show this and to have a book with. The book has over 200 illustrations to show that women have been playing, and also to research and to tell that story that we weren't only spectators of the game, we were also on the ice. 1982, first national championship. There was some, in the 1930s, there were some championships, but it was not exactly national, but Ontario was coming to Montreal. Prince Edward Island players were coming as well to the Montreal Forum to play, but it was the first national championship in '82. First Quebec team. France Saint-Louis was going to become, with Daniel Goyette, one of the best players of the province and one of the best players of the national team. In '87 in Mississauga, there was a first international encounter, and here in 1990 in Ottawa, first World Championship. That was quite something. Someone from here was there. I mean, there was no one attended, because they really, from what I read, it was quite something. It was quite an event, and women couldn't believe that for the first time they could figure out that maybe they would go at the Olympics one day, which happened in the same decade in 1998. Oh, I forgot Manon Rayon, who became the first woman to play in the NHL. She didn't play very long. She played for 20 minutes. She was, she's been told that she had been taken. It was more of a coup publicitaire. Publicity stunt, that it's because she was a beautiful young woman, and not because she was good and she was talented, but she had a lot of guts too, because what she told me is, she said, I was told no so often, because she had been playing with boys for her whole life, and she said, for once I was asked to do something like this, I was not going myself to say no to this opportunity, so I went. So that's it. So afterwards, Olympics, the story. Just these are the images of 2002 in Salt Lake City, 2006 in Torino, and 2010 with Marie-Philippe Poulin, who is quite an amazing player. I don't know if you've seen the final this year in Sochi. That was quite. I think I never yelled that much. I think. So it's what I was telling you about. It tells so much, and it's not. I wanted to do that book not only because it's hockey's history, and hockey history is fascinating because it tells a lot about who we are, but because it is in Quebec. I know it might sound all this very familiar to you, but in French Quebec, this story is totally unknown. And it's a known part of women's hockey history, and also that was why I thought it was important to that
book. You've been listening to a recording of Nos Glorieuses, 100 Years of Women's Hockey in Quebec. This talk was delivered by Lynda Baril as part of the Ottawa Historical Association lecture series on September 16, 2014. You can find recordings of other talks at Activehistory.ca.